So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Guy Denny. Guy is an interpretive naturalist, writer, and photographer with a wealth of knowledge about the natural history of Ohio. In 1999, he retired his position as chief of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Natural Areas and Preserves after a professional career spanning 33 years of public service. He's authored several books and articles on Ohio natural history and is the past editor of the DNAP newsletter, in which he published numerous articles and photographs. Since retiring, Denny has served on several boards. He currently serves as president of the Ohio Natural Areas and Preserves Association, which he helped establish in 2013, and is secretary-treasurer for the Outdoor Writers of Ohio. So please join me in welcoming Guy to the podium.
Yeah, I was hoping to have a monitor I could see what was going on here, so I'll just have to move to the center here, and I guess the red button is the advance? Yes. Okay, so I need to know. Should be interesting. For those of you who attended this conference in Cleveland, yeah, I guess it's been about 7 years ago, this is basically a review of the natural history of Ohio. For those of you new to the state who may have flown in or driven in, I want to try in the next 30 minutes convince you that Ohio is more than corn and soybeans and urban and suburban sprawl. So we'll start out with this map, which some of you are familiar with. This is a very simplified version of a map that the Ohio Biological Survey put out. And it depicts Ohio at the time of the earliest land surveys. It was based on the metes and bounds description of those surveyors. As you can see, there's quite a diversity of landscape types here in Ohio. And to fully appreciate and understand these, we have to look at back at some of the geologic and climatological events which help mold this diversity in our landscape, and that's what we want to do. Obviously, the bedrock geology is perhaps a good starting point because obviously it impacts the soils, the topography, and the soils impact plants. Plants in turn have a pretty good impact on the animal distribution. So we'll start there. Bedrock Ohio is fairly simple. It's all sedimentary bedrock that was deposited in Paleozoic seas. The oldest bedrock is actually in this area where we're located today, down in the Cincinnati area, the Ore Division limestone, which was laid down in some very shallow, clean tropical seas. At that time, the landmass, the tectonic plate that we're in now, was, we're told, just a little bit south of the equator. Our youngest bedrock is over on the other side of the state. That's the Permian Formation. Some geologists argue that actually that's kind of late Pennsylvania, but whatever, we're going to go with Permian. And that's the very youngest exposed bedrock that we have here in Ohio. It's sort of interesting that these layers of bedrock were originally laid down just like the layers of a cake, but then eventually we had a situation where we have some major basins that were created by sediments going into these ancient oceans, these seas, which pushed down certain areas of the mantle and other areas rose up, and we're on what's known as the Cincinnati Arch and the Finley Arch here in Ohio. And of course, as these were pushed upward, millions and millions of years of erosion leveled them off and beveled them off in such a way that if you take a look at our bedrock, we have these interesting lines of bedrock where basically the top of this big bow area was just beveled right off. Those of you familiar with Ohio might think that the highest elevations would be down in the Unglaciated southeastern part of the state. It's not. Our highest point is way over here in the Glacial Till Plains, the Bell Fountain outlier. If we take a look at the bedrock of Ohio from a profile, you'll see that our bedrock gently dips to the east. And actually, Indiana is sort of a reverse mirror image of this. Theirs dips to the west because, again, of the Cincinnati Arch. So in any event, this should give you a little bit of a background in terms of the geology of the state. I want to start out during the Cenozoic. There's no deposition after the Permian, so we really don't have any fossil history in Ohio at all. Were dinosaurs here? Probably. Evidence of them? Absolutely not. But we're going to start out about 50 million years ago when the landscape probably looked a little bit like down Larry Smith's neck of the woods down in Virginia, very strong southern influence. We're told that's largely due to this river system that was created when the Rocky Mountains, when the Appalachian Mountains are uplifted, and this, of course, is the Taze River, which some now argue that it really didn't go all the way over to the ancestral Mississippi River. It cut back on the Aragon River. Regardless, during the existence, the millions and millions of years of its existence, the Taze provided a continuum of habitat, or a corridor, for the migration of both plants and animals northward. And so we find that a number of these we call Taze disjuncts are still found here in Ohio. The umbrella magnolia, the big leaf magnolia are quite rare and are considered Taze age relics that were introduced and were much more widespread during the time of the Taze River. That's true of a number of other very colorful shrubs that we have and a number of plants. And these are found in one of the 5 physiographic regions of Ohio, the unglaciated Appalachian or Allegheny Plateau region. It's our most rugged topography, never glaciated, ancient soils. But Ohio, like most of the states in the Midwest, we have these physiographic regions, but they're just portions of much larger areas throughout the Midwest. We'll start with Shawnee State Forest, which is our largest state forest, what we affectionately call Little Smokies of Ohio, and it has probably the greatest wildness because of the rugged topography, did not lend itself to agriculture. So basically we find still the wildest parts of Ohio in that part of the state. We also find a number of these Taze age relics as well. Some of these plants, like some of these species, the next closest populations are in Tennessee, but we also have a number of other species which are typical Appalachian species that found their way up along the Taze system, and of course were able to maintain their position in that unglaciated Appalachian Plateau region, since the glaciers never really scoured the land there and destroyed the vegetation. It's interesting, if you go a little bit further east, we get into the Hocking Hills region, Hocking Hills State Park, Hocking Hills State Forest. We have the Blackhand Sandstone, which is a Mississippian formation, but the Blackhand is known for its spectacular formations, particularly in the Hocking Hills region. And a little bit further east yet, we get into the Pennsylvanian formation, into Zaleski State Forest, Lake Hope State Park. We get into the coal measures. And here we had, because of the geology, some very rich mineral deposits. But unfortunately, those rich mineral deposits, the iron ores, the coal, the limestone, really led to the demise, or at least degradation, of a lot of this part of the state. Probably the earliest exploration started in the early 1800s with the iron furnaces, which dotted this part of the state. They stripped the iron ores, they stripped the limestone beds for the flux, and of course, to feed these charcoal furnaces, they denuded the hills. Right on the hills of the charcoal furnaces came the coal mining era, and initially it started out with what we call drift mines, where that actually dug into sides of hills and followed the coal seams up. But later it was mechanized into the strip mining, or what a lot of folks call, sounds a little bit better, surface mining, but in fact it devastated the landscape. And this was one of the biggest monstrosities. It was an engineer's delight. This was Big Muskie. It's been since dismantled, but to give you an idea of the size, that's a full-size bulldozer down there. The operator who operated this was 6 stories up in a cab on top of this thing. It had a devastating impact on that part of the state. It's interesting that strip mining is pretty much a thing of the past now in Ohio, but a lot of these strip mine areas have been, quote, quote, reclaimed, but they have very shallow soil. The soil, most of the microbiology in the soil is gone. They're pretty well suited to non-season cold grasses that are non-native cold season grasses. And it's interesting that the landscape in a lot of these reclaimed areas looks a lot like Kansas, and apparently it does to the birds as well, because we find that a number of grassland species, western grassland species, which never occurred in this part of Ohio, have now colonized these mining areas. And I was surprised to find out that's also the case in Pennsylvania, in Indiana, Kentucky, a number of areas where these cold season non-native grasses have been planted. Well, we have the next major geologic event in Ohio about 1 million to 2 million years ago during the beginning of the Ice Age. And Ohio was glaciated at least 3 times, most recent being the Wisconsin Glacier. May have been glaciated 4 times, but we know we have evidence clearly of 3 times. And with the glacier, we found an interesting phenomena. As the glacial ice lumbered out of the north, in front of it, it was preceded a band of vegetation. But more importantly, the ice blocked that north-flowing Taze. And so we had this flooding that occurred in this mammoth lake tight, which covered parts of southeastern Ohio, parts of Kentucky, West Virginia, and inundated and destroyed a lot of the earlier vegetation, the Appalachian vegetation. But again, with the glaciers came a new element of diversity, and that was the boreal forest. Glaciers move very slowly, and preceding them was a band of boreal vegetation. And as the glaciers receded, that vegetation receded with it. And it's kind of interesting because this added another element of diversity to our landscape, which was the boreal forest influence. Of course, as the glaciers receded, the impact that they had on the landscape diminished, and so a lot of these northern species disappeared, except around some very special places where special environmental conditions allowed many of these species to survive, and primarily the Kettle Lake bogs that we find remnants in the Midwest. And of course, during the time of the glacier, they were readily colonized by species more typical much further north. And as the glaciers receded, the upland vegetation, the boreal vegetation disappeared, but a lot of these northern species survived around these Kettle Lake bogs, and we have several in Ohio. And they're high quality with many, many fascinating plants. Again, disjuncts, species that are quite common to our north, but quite rare here in Ohio. And we have a great deal of pleasure in being able to explore these. But Kettle Lake bogs are more than fascinating floristic complexes. They also are basically time capsules, because every spring as pollen rained down from the surrounding vegetation, from the minute these were formed, those pollen particles were preserved in the peat sediments. So paleobotanists, by taking samples of peat at various levels and analyzing the pollen, can get a pretty good idea of the climatic changes which happened around these deep kettle hole bogs ever since they were first formed. And as you might imagine, at the depths of these bogs, we find pollen dominated primarily by spruce and fir, which would indicate a cooler and moisture conditions than presently exist. But as we go up that column, we start seeing a diminish of spruce and fir and an increase, a dramatic increase in oak and hickory, which would indicate a warmer and drier climate. And then, interestingly enough, when we get to that level of that pollen column, about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, we see a predominance of grass pollen and tree pollens diminish. So this equates with the hypsothermal interval, a period of warmer, drier weather that occurred post-glacially. Not a whole lot warmer, not a whole lot drier than presently, but perhaps the most characteristic feature was the fact that this is a time when there were severe droughts which would last for many, many years, which, of course, the trees, the deciduous forest couldn't compete with. They died out. It allowed the prairie, the grasslands of the west, the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, to extend pretty far eastward, and probably even further than this particular prairie peninsula design that was first developed by Edgar Nelson Transeau. Now, Dr. Transeau wasn't the first person to realize that this was an extension of the prairie, but he was the first one to capture this in print in 1935 in the Journal of Ecology. But it added another element of diversity to our landscape. The tallgrass prairies of the Midwest became part of the Ohio landscape, and even much further east. Dominant species, of course, the typical big blue stem or terrific grass. Indian grass was another common member of the tallgrass family. And in some of the wet areas, the prairie cordgrass, and there were others as well. And of course, along with the prairie grasses came the prairie wildflowers, or the prairie forbs as they're collectively referred to. And the megafauna. It's amazing to a lot of Ohioans that the greater prairie chicken at one point in time was so abundant in Ohio that we actually had a hunting season on it, which didn't end until about 1901, I think it was. Last prairie chicken was seen in about 1893, but wheels of government move slowly sometimes. Those prairie areas were often avoided by the early settlers. If you were unfortunate enough to inherit or buy a piece of prairie land, what you found out is that those cast iron and wooden plows that worked so well in the east didn't work here in the Midwest in these prairie sods. And if you were going to plow that prairie, you had to hire a team of sod busters to be able to break through that sod. And that often cost even more than the land itself. Things began to change, though, when John Deere publicized, I shouldn't say publicized, he wasn't the one that invented this polysteel plow, but he's the one that marketed it. And within a generation or two, the prairies of tallgrass prairie region, not only of Ohio, but of the entire tallgrass prairie region disappeared under the plow. It became some of our most fertile farmland. Most of our prairies in Ohio occur, but not all, but most of them occur in this central lowlands till plains. This is an area of the state, the physiographic region that was glaciated, has very rich soils because they were enriched by the glacial tills that were deposited there, and we're right here. We're in this particular physiographic region of the state. Of course, most of those prairies are gone now. They're farmland, but there's still remnants around. Although displaced by agricultural land, it brought in a whole new realm of wildlife diversity. Mostly these are edge species, as you well recognize, but a distinct fauna unto itself. There are a few of the prairie species left, few and far between, but for the most part, they're long gone. We still find some of the remnant prairies along railroad tracks, along highways. Some of our major wildlife areas were beautiful prairies that farmers laughed when the state was dumb enough to buy them, because how could you use these wet soils or wet prairies? Well, now they're invaluable to us. And a lot of the prairie cemeteries. So there's these little remnants all throughout the area that support a diversity of these beautiful prairie wildflowers. Bison, the elk are gone, the great prairie chicken's gone, but we still have the flora to admire and to remember the extension of prairie that once occurred in a large area, anywhere from 1,000 to perhaps 2,000 square miles of tallgrass prairie in Ohio at the time of land settlement. It's interesting in this part, in this physiographic region, and some of you will be visiting some fens. We have Gallagher Fen. I know some of you will be going on that field trip. Fens are kind of nifty. These are prairie fens. They have a very strong assemblage of prairie species in them, along with eastern and some northern species as well. Marvelous places, and right now you should have a great time because there should be some nice things blooming. Just to give you a little background on fens, the fens in this portion of the state, in fact throughout almost all of the state except maybe along the shores of Lake Erie, basically develop on glacial gravels. They're a function of the glaciers, and as the rainwater falls to the air, mixes with molecules of carbon dioxide, becomes mild carbonic acid, and as these liquids flow through these limestone-rich gravels, they dissolve out the calcium carbonate. And of course, where these bicarbonates come to the surface, the carbon dioxide is lost, marl, calcium carbonate in the form of marl, travertine, tufa is left behind. It's a very special type of environment. We find that the largest of these, and probably one of the most fascinating, and I understand there's a field trip there, will be cedar bog, which is basically an arborvitae fen, boreal fen, but it also has a strong prairie element to it as well. It was the first natural area, by the way, in the state of Ohio ever acquired. Back in the 1920s, it was acquired long before there was a natural areas program. This is the first area that the state of Ohio actually spent money on to buy as a natural area. Fens typically have a indicator species, the shrub singful is one of the most characteristic, and there's a number of other species that are found pretty much exclusively in fens. And a good indicator species, and as I said, when you're out at Gallagher, hopefully you'll have a chance to see the grass parnassus blooming. Hopefully it will still be in bloom. The Ohio goldenrod, Riddell's goldenrod, and of course everyone's favorite, the fringed gentians, both Prospera and Conitas. So lots of neat things to see this time of year in the fens. Fens also support some interesting wildlife. Most of the fens in Ohio are very fragmented, they're very small, but there are a few nice little amenities in the way of the fauna that's still found there. You're not apt to see either one of these guys on your trip, but you might. Why we're still in the the glaciated Allegheny, or till plain region, the glaciated till plains, I just point out because these rich soils, typically the woodlands in this area of the state are characterized by beech maple forest, and on the wetter areas, elm and ash, and that's in comparison to the unglaciated Appalachian Plateau that has older, more acid, nutrient-poor soils where you find typically oak hickory, and then you find mixed mesophytic forests, usually in the valleys. We do have a few, not very many, but we do have a few areas protecting the state that are old-growth forests. Johnson Woods is one of the nicer ones. Very close to here is a beautiful beech maple forest at Houston Woods State Park. So there are a few, but for the most part, the forests have given way. But they too have their own special species of animal life, and of course the ephemerals, the spring ephemerals are spectacular, as they are in all the woodlands that are left that have been saved throughout the Midwest. Now I want to drop down to along the Ohio River to one of the smallest areas, physiographic regions in the state of Ohio, and this is the Bluegrass section. Again, we have a very small portion of it in Ohio. It's a much larger area to the south and west of Adams County. But we find some interesting phenomena there, these open cedar glades dominated by red cedar over very shallow calcareous soils with dolomitic bedrock very close to the surface, and they have their own special plant animal communities that we'll take a look at here. And it's really interesting that we find some of the same species of plants, prairie plants we find in the tallgrass glaciated part of the state. But E. Lucy Brown, who did most of her life's work, the famous ecologist from University of Cincinnati, believes strongly that probably these cedar barrens were remnants, the prairie species were remnants of an earlier glaciation. And although we often talk about the hypothermal interval occurring after Wisconsin glaciation, there's pretty good evidence that we had these warmer, drier periods after each major glacial occurrence. We find, instead of bur oak in these cedar glades, we find post oak and blackjack oak, which are indicators of much more calcareous soils. And we find a number of very rare plants down there, which are often more typical of the Missouri Ozarks, and this sort of supports E. Lucy's belief that these prairies predated the Wisconsin glaciation. Then I want to jump up along Lake Erie to the Huron-Erie Lake Plains physiographic region. We have some really interesting habitats along that lakeshore as well. Perhaps the most interesting at all are the oak openings, which some of you, like Rick Bryant, who grew up in and knows all about. Interesting area, west of Toledo in western Lucas County, parts of Fulton and Henry County. Areas of sand deposits, about 150 square miles or more, it extends up into Michigan. This again is a product of glaciation, of continental glaciation. There were many of these glacial lakes that covered that northwestern corner of the state during the Ice Age. The oak openings itself was pretty much the sand deposits were deposited in Glacial Lake Warren, one of many glacial lakes which occurred as the ice would advance or recede and then would stay in that position for a very long period of time, have a well-defined shoreline. But essentially the sand deposits in Lake Warren, as soon as the glacial ice was freed up in the Niagara outlet, basic lake levels dropped and these sands were left high and dry to be reworked by the winds into sand dunes and blowouts. Sand tends to be very acid, very low in nutrients, so we have these scatter openings of oaks, which hence the name oak openings, mostly scarlet and black oak, very similar to the habitat in Indiana, parts of Illinois, Wisconsin. Beautiful oak openings with some very spectacular plant life as well, which survives in this kind of these dry sands that are very nutrient poor. In fact, it's interesting, we have probably more state-listed species of plants in the oak openings than any other geographic area in the state of Ohio. And the reason for that is not only because of these sands and the sand dunes, but also because of the sedge meadows that are there. But we also, again, in this very special habitat, have very special animals as well. The animals are interrelated with the plants, and poster child of the oak openings is the common blue butterfly, which disappeared from Ohio at one point in time, but thanks to our friends up in Michigan, Allegan Wildlife Area, and with a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the Toledo Zoo, the ODNR, these have been reintroduced into Ohio and seem to be doing rather well, Kitty Todd Preserve in particular. But again, this area of the state was a glacial lake because of the impervious glacial till and the lacustrine deposits. We find that the water table is very, very high. So we have these sedge meadows, and in these sedge meadows, which could be right next to these acid sand dunes, we have, again, a whole array of very fascinating and very specialized plants. And I think this is why we find such diversity in the oak openings region of northwestern Ohio. We once had the Black Swamp, which is south of the oak openings itself along the Maumee River. It was an extensive marshland or swampland that extended all the way back to Indiana. That's unfortunately been drained. The only remnants, and there's very small remnants, the Toledo Metro Parks has a few remnants like in Pearson Park, but for the most part it's gone. On the other hand, the marshes of Lake Erie are still pretty much intact, and this is a very special part of that Lake Plain community. It too has its own special variety of plants and of great interest, and animals as well. It's an interesting area to explore, and the marshes are still relatively intact. And I think a lot of you who are birders have probably been to Crane Creek, an area, McGee Marsh, where the neotropical migrants bunch up before crossing across Lake Erie. And so it's some spectacular birding. We also have a number of wildlife refuges along there, including the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, because of the birding associated with the marshes of Lake Erie. Certainly the shorebirds, a little bit past now, I think Larry Roche, most of these birds are through, but the shorebirds are spectacular in the fall of the year. Also in the spring of the year, we find some real goodies. And of course, then in March, we get the waterfowl that move through, and it's rather spectacular areas as well. So the Lake Erie marshes are very, very special in and by themselves. And very close by, just a little bit east of the marshes, we have the Marblehead Peninsula. And here is the home for one of our rarest plants, the lakeside daisy, federal listed as well as a state listed plant. These pictures were taken within the Lafarge Quarry, which unfortunately owns most of the Marblehead Peninsula, and it is the largest quarry operation in the state of Ohio, at least open limestone quarry area. And it's sad because there's still a lot of very fascinating geology here, some glacial striations, glacial grooves, and of course the lakeside daisies. There's probably more lakeside daisies within the quarry than in the small preserve that ODNR was able to set aside some years back. There's going to be a paper tomorrow that Jennifer Windus will be giving, talking about some of the efforts that we had moving lakeside daisies to the quarries on the Kelly's Island. And the islands themselves are very, very fascinating. And they, in and by themselves, are quite diversified, and there's a lot of fun things to see. But we actually made a major effort to move lakeside daisies there. I won't tell you more about it. You can see Jennifer's talk, but it really worked out very, very well. Of course, if you've been to Kelly's Island, not only could you see the new populations of lakeside daisy there, but also the glacial grooves. This is also home for a very successfully brought back endangered species, the Lake Erie water snake, thanks to the efforts of Kristen Sanford. Kelly's Island, we don't have much in the way of alvar. For those of you familiar with alvar, Michigan has extensive alvar, New York State. We have just a little teeny bit of it on Kelly's Island that's surviving, but it's still very diversified and has a lot of the typical alvar species. Actually, most of the Marblehead Peninsula was alvar, but again, most of it has been destroyed. But if you visit that site, particularly to see lakeside daisy about mid-May, it's a good time to drop down to the nearby Castelia Prairie, which is just south. This is a prairie fen and home to one of the largest populations of the small white lady slipper in Ohio. In fact, in the Midwest, thousands of plants on any good year. And then I want to swing up along the shores of Lake Erie to the lake shore up there. Back in Jim Bissell's area of Ashtabula County, we find a lot of fascinating plants. Again, this is sort of a function of the glaciers. The glacial ice, which is so thick in the Erie Basin, so depressed the bedrock, the Atlantic Ocean, before crustal rebound occurred, was able to extend well into the Great Lakes and provided a corridor, a continuum of habitat for a number of Atlantic coastal plain species to become well established around the Great Lakes. Crustal rebound since has occurred, and it's isolated the ocean from it, but the plants still remain around the lake shore. And the last physiographic region I want you to take a look at is this one. It's 300 miles long from Ashtabula County all the way down to south of Chillicothe, Highlands Nature Sanctuary, and Nancy Stranahan will be here. She's giving a program on that. You can learn a little more about it. But way up here in Jim Bissell's neck of the woods, the snow belt region, we'll start. But I do want to mention this also is an area where we have lots of bogs and fens, although many of the fens up here tend to be, they have some western species, but they have a lot more northern species as well. So they're somewhat distinct from those counterparts that we find in this physiographic region in the glaciated the Appalachian, the glaciated till plains. Up in Ashtabula County, we actually have an extension of the Allegheny Mountains, the hemlock, white pine, northern hardwood forest community. It's interesting because up here we find hemlocks in the uplands. Elsewhere in Ohio, they're pretty much restricted to the deep, narrow valleys, the gorges. Up here in the snow belt, they seem to do well in the uplands, along with a number of mountain species, typically Allegheny mountain species, that are found in this area of the state, in the snow belt region, and found nowhere else in the state. Some very fascinating flora. So it's a little bit of part of the Allegheny Mountains that we find here in Ohio as well. And even though this area, this physiographic region has been glaciated, it's very rough topography. The glaciers barely made it across it. They did not get into the unglaciated plateau. So we have sort of a mix of farmland in the valleys and some areas where you have flat lands, but we also have some rugged topography. And again, there's an element of wildness that we find in Ashtabula County and the snow belt that we don't find elsewhere in Ohio. As we move our way down, we stopped at Mohican State Park. The Mohican River Gorge is one of those fascinating gorges that, again, it was glaciated, parts of it. Glacier came very close, and actually part of the park itself was glaciated, close enough that, like many of these deep ravines that we find in Ohio, many northern species survive because, again, it's a situation where you have very cold, very moist, deep ravines where the sunlight doesn't bake them out. And so a lot of these northern plants have been able to survive there ever since the Ice Age. And it's kind of interesting, again, hemlock is very characteristic of these, and we find that a number of neotropical migrants that normally would move on to Canada nest will actually nest in these gorges, particularly in Hocking Hills, but also in places like the Mohican Gorge and others found within that region. Unfortunately, with the hemlock woolly adelgia, it'll be interesting to see how this impacts those birds. And finally, we're going to end up way down below south of Chillicothe, where we have these beautiful mounds of gravel. That actually, this is not Wisconsin, but this is Illinois glacial outwash material, the terraces, right up against the Allegheny escarpment. And that was basically the terminus of this particular area. So I said Nancy Stranahan will be talking about the Highlands Nature Sanctuary. It's a marvelous area. Here again, we have these deep gorges with a number of northern species in them and quite a diversity. But here we have gorges not made up of sandstone, but rather of dolomite and some limestone with these arborvitae or white cedar clinging to them. And we have a diversity of plant animal life there as well. And I'll save that for Nancy's talk. The point that I want to show you, and hopefully that we've gotten across, is that even though Ohio has definitely been segmented, been fragmented, and developed extensively, there are still these pockets of remnant natural landscape, and there are pockets of great interest, pockets that we strive to protect so that we, the next big step, and I know this is one of Reed Noss's favorite things, is let's try and connect these so we can have corridors, because when we isolate these little patches, that's kind of neat because we're saving the parts. Now we have to put all those parts together so they become functional. So with that, I thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll let the next speaker come up.